What's your name, boy?
Hugo. Hugo Cabret.
A memory from his past.
Who built him?
I would think a magician. The most complicated one I've ever seen.
Can we fix him?
Of course we can fix it.
A mysterious connection.
Hey! Where did you get this? I need it to fix something. This is marvelous.
A secret.
What is that? I think it's a message from my father. Why would my key fit into your father's machine?
To finding his way home.
This is a treacherous place. Do you understand? Watch your step.
We could get into trouble. That's how you know it's an adventure.
You've tried to forget the past for so long. Maybe it's time to try and remember.
The story's not over yet.
This Thanksgiving, Academy Award-winning director Martin Scorsese invites you on an incredible journey.
Stop that child! Apprehend!
Once upon a time, I met a boy named Hugo Cabret. He searched to find a secret message. I need to know what this means. And how that message lit his way. Hugo! All the way home.
Hugo.
Hello. I am so thrilled to be here today to speak to all of you about storytelling and the work that I do, and to look a little bit at the invention of Hugo Cabret. Start here, which is a book. This is a book about how stories are told. It's very much about the cinema and how the cinema tells stories. About a boy who meets a famous filmmaker named George Méliès. So when I found out that a famous filmmaker, Martin Scorsese, was going to make a movie from this book, I was beyond shocked, beyond thrilled. Storytelling in the cinema is a part of my history. It's a part of my blood. I'm related, distantly, to David O. Selznick, who was a great film producer. He produced Gone with the Wind, King Kong, and many other films. Of course, I am a part of the family tree. He's from the Los Angeles movie-making side of the Selznicks, and I am from the New Jersey dry cleaning side of the Selznicks. But we are related. And so looking at the cinema as I was growing up, seeing my name made me feel a very direct connection. But for me, the way that I knew early on that I wanted to tell stories was through books. This is a quote from a mentor of mine, Remy Charlip, who made some of the best children's books that I remember from when I was growing up. And he says, "A thrilling picture book not only makes beautiful single images or sequential images, but also allows us to become aware of a book's unique physical structure by bringing our attention once again to that momentous moment, the turning of the page." The turning of the page is like a moment in cinema when we cut from one scene to the next. It could be a moment when we zoom in on something so that we are being told visually that this is important. And in books, generally, we have two things to work with. We have words and we have pictures. And the way these two things work together is what interests me the most. The great designer Chip Kidd talks about his first day of design school. He was told that you can either use words or you can use pictures, but you can't use them together at the same moment. If you have the word apple, then you don't need a picture of an apple. If you have a picture of an apple, You don't need the word. Together, they are redundant. How do you separate them and make something new happen? Where the Wild Things Are by Maurice Sendak is what I consider the greatest book ever made for adults or children. If you're familiar with it, it begins when Max, this little boy, is making mischief of one kind and another, and his mother sends him to his room without any dinner. And that very night, a forest grows in his room, and it grows and grows and grows until a sea comes by, a boat tumbles by, and he takes the boat to the land of where the wild things are, till he has this wild rumpus. And then he realizes he misses his mother, he misses home, he's hungry. So he goes home, and his mother has left his dinner for him, and it was still hot. Now, if you go back and you look at this book again, you'll realize that every choice, every word, every picture, every page turn, every size of every image is being used to help tell the story. So we start with the pictures very small. You notice they get bigger and bigger and bigger until they take over the entire book, and there's no more room for words, there's no more room for white space. And when he gets back, his room, which originally was very small, has grown. So he's grown from his adventure. And it was still hot. Maurice Sendak decided to not illustrate this page. This page has no pictures, just the words, and it was still hot. To me, and it was still hot means, and his mother still loved him. And even though he had a temper tantrum and his mother was angry and she sent him to his room, she still loved him. And that was something that could speak directly to the reader without an image. And so I've always thought that that was a very, very powerful choice. So when I was illustrating the invention of Hugo Cabret, I was thinking about cinema and how cinema tells its stories. And I was thinking about where the wild things are and the wild rumpus. And I was wondering if there was a way that I could tell the story in a novel for older kids and maybe some adults who might want to read it, but to fill it with images so that part of the story, part of the book, is being told through images. So as you turn through the beginning of the invention of Hugo Cabret, there's no language. Every page turn is another picture that brings us closer and closer into the train station, into the crowd, where we first meet Hugo Cabret. Now, when I was making Hugo, I knew that I wanted to tell a single story in words and pictures because it was about the cinema, and the cinema uses words in different ways, images, movement. So that was the idea for the pictures in The Invention of Hugo Cabret. The second book I did after that, Wonderstruck, was about two children who are deaf, and they run away to New York. And in this book, there's two parallel stories, one entirely in pictures and one entirely in words. These two stories weave back and forth until they come together at the end. And the story that's told entirely in pictures is the story of a girl who was born deaf. Because if you're born deaf, the way that you experience the world is mostly visual. Your language is a visual language. So I wanted the pictures to parallel her experience. The book I did after that, The Marvels, begins with 200 pages of pictures that tell the story of a single family over 150 years. And then there's a cliffhanger, and the last 200 pages of the book are just words. And you begin to realize as you're reading that story that it's related to the first story, and you begin to have a memory of those pictures that you saw. So the images serve as a kind of memory. So with each of these books, the use of pictures is there to help underscore the narrative, the story, the psychology of the characters. This is Maurice Sendak, the writer and illustrator of Where the Wild Things Are. We became friends, and we were very close for the last 7 years of his life. And it was not only his work, but my friendship with Maurice that inspired the invention of Hugo Cabret and all these thoughts about illustration. And when we first met, we were both coincidentally reading the American poet Walt Whitman. Maurice had never read Whitman before. I had done a children's book about Whitman. And Maurice told me a really incredible story about Walt Whitman that I couldn't forget. When Walt Whitman was a young man, he wrote a sequence of poems about a love affair that he had with another man. There's 12 poems in this sequence called Live Oak with Moss. And he finished the poems. He never told anybody about the poems. He never wrote anybody about the poems. He never published them as he wrote them. Instead, he took them, cut them up, rearranged them, and hid them in a book that he made called Leaves of Grass. And no one knew that these 12 poems existed for about 100 years. And in the 1950s, a scholar found this clue, put the original 12 poems back together, and now we know about these poems. And for the past 50 years, 60 years or so, the academic world has read these poems, but the general public has not known about them. Maurice told me that he was thinking about illustrating the first book of these poems. And I was thrilled by that idea because I would love to see what Maurice would do. But Maurice told me that poems should never be illustrated. He said poetry is meant to exist, as you've heard today, between the poet and the person who is reading the poem, who is hearing the poem. That is a direct connection, and illustration, Maurice felt, could get in the way of that relationship. But after Maurice passed away, the 200th anniversary of Walt Whitman's birth was coming up, and I was asked to make a book to celebrate Whitman's anniversary, the anniversary of his birth. So I thought, is there a way that I can tell a story, illustrate a version of these poems while still not illustrating the poems in some way and trying to honor what Maurice said? So what I ended up making was this book, Live Oak with Moss, which is about 200 drawings or about 200 pages of drawings that form a kind of framework with images drawn from the poetry that lead up to the poems. And then when you get to the poems, you have stepped through this framework, you've stepped through this structure, and now you're ready to read the poems. And hopefully as the images come up in the poems, they will form a memory also of some of the images so that you feel like you're standing on a firm base as you read the poems. These are some of the images from Live Oak with Moss. And then from there, it goes to the poetry. Thank you. This is one of the poems from Live Oak with Moss, my favorite. O you whom I often and silently come where you are, that I may be with you, as I walk by your side, or sit near, or remain in the same room with you. Little you know the subtle electric fire that for your sake is playing within me. and then you read the poems, you have them as a gift, as I think they were really meant to be. Whitman never shared them with anyone, but I think that the act of writing, the act of putting something down on paper, is something that I think we all do as a way, even if we don't really believe anyone will ever read it, it's meant as a possibility. It's meant as an idea that something could happen. We could share. We could perhaps be less lonely in some fashion. And so when I'm thinking about my books, when I'm thinking about a story, I'm thinking about words, I'm thinking about pictures, but most importantly, I'm thinking about where they come together and where they stay apart, and that space between the words and the pictures, which is where I think we as an audience, we as a friend, we as a lover, we as someone who has a relationship now with the person who's made the work, we as a reader begin a relationship with the author, with the artist, the minute we open that book, the minute we begin watching the film. We are now part of a relationship. And it's in that space, in that moment, with the gap in the words and the pictures, where I think the magic and the poetry and the love happens. Thank you very much.
Thank you.